All right, everybody. Hello and welcome. Hope you had a good break. Welcome back. It's the last week of class, as I'm sure that you are all aware of. Actually, for us, today is the last day that we're doing any new stuff. So this is the last new material that you're going to see for this class. We are going to meet on Wednesday, which will be an exam review day. So we'll go over stuff, prep you for exam 2, which I believe is on the 16th of December. Yes, okay, thanks for confirming. It's on the 16th of December, which is like 2 weeks away. So a lot of time between now and then, but some other stuff for you to pay attention to between now and then. The homework assignment is due at the end of this week. If you have late coupons left, you can use them on this homework assignment. I don't care. Cash them in if you got them. That's fine with me. So submit it whenever you get it finished. If you got those late coupons, trying to think what else there was. I know there was something else I wanted to say. Oh yeah, I'm gonna post some past exams tonight. I was gonna do it before class, I just ran out of time. So I'm gonna post some past exams tonight. So hopefully you can take a look at those between now and Wednesday when we do the exam review session. Homework 4, grading is in progress and it's going pretty well so far. I'm hoping to have that finished up by the end of the week. So by the end of this week, you should have a pretty good idea where you stand in the class. I think that's about it. That's about all I got for you right now. I guess one other little announcement reminder. I know last week of class is kind of tough, kind of crazy. It's crazy for me too. I'm very busy this week, but I want to reiterate something that I said a few weeks ago. If you're feeling stressed out, if you are having trouble keeping up with everything and you need to release the pressure somehow, come have a chat with me. I can't make any promises about what I can do, but your health, especially your mental health, is definitely far more important to me than meeting any particular deadlines or trying to get things done for this class. So I can't help you with the other classes, but I can try to help you with this class. So if that's something that you need, please come talk to me, come have a chat with me, send me an email or Piazza if you don't want to talk to me in person, whatever you need to do. We can have a chat, we can figure something out, or we can try to figure something out. All right, any questions about the upcoming due dates, deadlines, other stuff that's going on before we hop into our final topic of the semester? We all good? Cool. All right, sweet. Today we're going to talk about security then. We've kind of dabbled in security a little bit here and there over the course of the semester. We're going to wrap things up today by talking about security. The good news about this topic is that security is actually fairly similar regardless of what kind of database you're using. So if I'm using a SQL database or a NoSQL database or any of the many different versions of SQL databases, the security perspectives are generally about the same. So this topic will cover, all areas that we have touched on this semester. So let's dive right in. There are a lot of different types of security that we are concerned about. So I'm actually going to skip the first one for a moment and talk, about the second one, the legal considerations. Of course, there are lots of laws, privacy laws governing what companies can and cannot do with your data that, of course, need to be followed very strictly, or else, you run the risk of getting fines or perhaps even jail time. But even without those laws, right, there are ethical considerations as well. So just because a piece of data doesn't necessarily have to be kept private, there still can be good reasons to do so. For example, if I give a website my phone number or my email address, and they start giving that phone number or email address to other people, is it against the law? No, not really. They probably had something in their license agreement that I totally took the time to read that says they can do that, but I'm still going to be upset about it, right? Because that's more spam, that's more phone calls that I'm going to get. So there's still a general expectation that that kind of data is going to be kept private, even if there's no laws around that governing its particular use. There's also system considerations. So what part of the system is responsible for the security? So our system is very broad. We're, of course, interested in the database in this class, but even the database has multiple levels with which to consider. We started this semester all the way down at the file level, right? So how do I restrict file access? How do I restrict access to individual tables, or even the database as a whole, right? Something to consider. And then security is not necessarily an on-off switch. It's not necessarily can I see the data or not. There are different levels involved. So we need to have a way of incorporating those different levels of security, which can be very, very detailed. The number of levels of security that we have can actually be quite vast depending on the situation. So these are all kinds of things that we need to consider when broaching this topic of security. What are we trying to protect against? We're trying to protect against various types of threats. So loss of integrity is the idea that somebody can get in and modify data. So this is the classic example of like somebody hacking into the school's database to give themselves all A's, right? That's a loss of database integrity. Somebody accessed that data that wasn't supposed to, and they changed it to make something more favorable for themselves. Hacking into a bank to put $1 million into your account, right? Those kinds of things. Loss of availability would mean I'm crashing your server. I'm bringing your database down. I'm going up the work so that nobody else can access it, which has a ripple effect then, right? Can bring your entire application down, more than likely. So it can prevent people from using your application, prevent people from accessing their data, which again, if we're talking about things like school records or bank accounts, if I can't access my money, that's a problem, right? Wikipedia actually had an attack recently that brought it down, a loss of availability attack. And then finally, some of the ones that get the most press are loss of confidentiality. So this is exposing information that should be private, taking somebody's credit card information, taking somebody's, even their contact information, right? Can you steal all my money if you just have my phone number? Probably not, but I still don't want you to have it, right? I still don't want that to be public information. So taking credit card numbers is obvious, taking social security numbers is an obvious loss of confidentiality, but there are other things that constitute losses of confidentiality as well. So it's our job then to make sure that we protect against all of these avenues of attack as best as we possibly can. All right, so how do we do that? The primary mechanism that's in use is access control. We're basically asking who is allowed to access what. So this is based around the idea of user accounts. This is not a new idea. This is something that many applications, many websites have. You've certainly seen this in some shape or form, probably not related to a database necessarily, but it also applies to databases as well as other kinds of websites. And so we're going to track every operation that a user performs and make sure that they have the permissions to do those operations. They have the ability, the right to see and manipulate that sensitive data. So we have two questions we need to answer here. What data is in need of being protected? What data is in need of being monitored? And then who has the right to see that protected data? Who has the right to access that protected data? So in terms of determining what data needs to be protected, this is, in a sense, declaring it as a sensitive piece of data. And a piece of data can be declared sensitive for multiple reasons. One reason might be that it's inherently sensitive. So, for example, if medical records, right, are an example of inherently sensitive data. The fact that they even exist makes it sensitive in itself. I don't want somebody to know my health records necessarily, right? If information about a particular diagnosis or treatment that I was going through would get out into the public, I would consider that a breach of confidentiality. Sometimes data is sensitive because of where it came from. So if the person who told me that piece of information wants to be kept confidential, wants to be kept anonymous, wants to stay out of the spotlight, then I need to protect that data so as to protect the source that it came from. Sometimes we're just going to declare data as sensitive. The users are going to tell you, this data is sensitive. Don't share it with anybody. You all have actually probably even seen this with the WashU system, right? I get a course roster every semester, and on that roster, I see students have highlighted, which indicates that they have told WashU that they do not want any of their data exposed to anybody for any reason, right? It's kind of interesting that you have to opt into that, but that's a different discussion, I suppose. And then we have this idea of partial sensitivity. So, for example, I work for WashU, right? And I'm sure I'm in WashU's database somewhere, perhaps multiple databases, and they're tracking my employee information. And so stuff like my name, my job title, right, where my office is, that's all part of my employee record, and that's totally fine to be exposed to the world. That's public information. But other stuff, like my employee ID number, my salary, right, things like that, are confidential. So we need to think of that as, yes, the employee record exists, but the world is not able to access the entire record. They can only access part of it unless they have permissions to touch the sensitive parts of that particular record. So once we've made the determination as to whether or not a piece of data is sensitive and why, then we have the question to answer, when is it safe to actually reveal that sensitive data to somebody? And there's three things that we need to take into account here. One is whether or not that piece of data is available. What's availability again? This will be on the exam for sure. What's availability? How does it apply in this context? It's not really a security question at all. It's actually a review from a couple weeks back. Yeah. How often? So availability is typically expressed as a percentage, right? The uptime. So in this context, what does availability mean? It means, can I see this piece of data right now, right? When might I not be able to see this piece of data? What's a reason why the data would not be available? We talked about this a while back. Servers down, that's one instance, yep. Another, perhaps more common instance, there are times when we intentionally make data unavailable as part of the natural process of the database. Lock, yeah, locking. Data's been locked, doing some kind of concurrence, doing some kind of updates on the data. Data's been locked. So step one actually has nothing to do with security at all. It's just, can I read the data? Is the data available right now? And then the last two, access acceptability. Am I personally, is Doug Shook allowed to access that piece of data? Have they been put on the approved list of somebody who can access that piece of data? And then not only that, even if I personally am allowed to access that piece of data, the system needs to have some assurance that I am who I say I am, right? Any one of you could walk up to, the HR department at WashU and say, hey, I'm Professor Shook, give me my money, right? And they're going to look at you and say, what? They're going to say, first they're going to say, you have direct deposit. I don't know what you're talking about. And then they're going to say, can you prove it, right? Can you prove that you're Professor Shook? Can you show me your ID? Can you provide some other form of identification? So on the computer, that means, well, more often than not, some kind of a password, right? Some kind of a password system. The other part of access control is the actual privileges that you are allowed to execute. Once we've determined the sensitive data, the data is not useful to me unless people can access it. So I need to determine who can access that data and also what they are allowed to do to that data. So not all operations are created equal, right? For example, you as students have access to your transcript, correct? You can look at your transcript all day long, but you cannot change that data, right? Well, you can. It takes, a semester's worth of hard work, right, to get a good grade in a class to change your transcript, but you can't actually go in there and manipulate the transcript data. So you have the ability to read that information, but not write to it, not modify that piece of data. So that's a kind of privilege. You have a read privilege, but not necessarily a write privilege on that piece of data. And so we can talk about the various forms that these privileges take. they can be given out on the individual account level. So what am I, as an individual user, allowed to do? They can also be handed out on a relation by relation level. So not just what am I as an individual user allowed to do, but what am I as an individual user allowed to do with this particular table, right? So let's take a look at some examples of what this might look like in an actual database. To give somebody a privilege, we use the grant command. So the first example that you see here of the grant command, grant create on database to A1, means that this user, A1, has the ability to create things, create tables, create relationships, create whatever they want within this particular database. So this is a permission that's been applied to the user that is independent of a relation. It's not tied to a single table, right? This next one is tied to a specific table. You can see that now I am granting insert and delete abilities on the employees and the departments table. So now these particular operations are tied to a particular set of relations for a particular user. And, alternatively, I can grant select. So this is basically granting write privileges. This is granting read privileges. This third example has an additional optional clause here with grant option. This is like has a cascading effect. It's not only saying that you have the ability to read this data, but it's also saying that you have the ability to designate other people the ability to read this data as well. I can pass the grant on to other users in the database if I want to. And then if I want to take privileges away, we use the revoke command, which says, all right, you can no longer read this this data from the employee table anymore. So it seems fairly straightforward, correct? Where is all this being stored in the database? The database has to remember all these different privileges, right? Where am I going to stash that? Or what kind of information is this? Starts with an M. Metadata, yeah, this is another example of metadata. Metadata stored, tables in the catalog. That's right, in the catalog. But wait a second, there's sort of an additional wrinkle here, right? Additional wrinkle on top of that. Because what if I, as a user, could see all of this metadata? That could also be a security risk in itself, correct? Then I would know what accounts I want to target, what accounts I want to try and gain access to. So not only do we have this metadata that is dictating who can access what, but this metadata itself is sensitive and needs to be protected and needs to be governed with privileges and access management, just like the other sensitive data in our database. All right, so this idea of managing users is a very common one, and it works, but it's very tedious, especially if you have a lot of users on your system. So this idea of role-based control came along, which allows you to put users into buckets called roles, and then assign privileges to those individual roles, which are then shared across all users that belong to those roles. So now instead of having to touch each individual user saying you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, I put them all in a bucket and then I say, all right, everybody with this role is allowed to do this. And so there are some roles built into most databases out of the box, admin roles, read-only roles, write roles, things like that, which you can add users to. And you also have the ability to create your own roles and assign whatever privileges to those roles that you want. User-based permissions and role-based permissions both exist. And so sometimes there can be conflicts between those two, right? What if What if my role says I'm not allowed to look at this table, but my individual user says that I am? My individual user permission says that I am allowed to look at this table. Which one wins? And we could ask the opposite question too, right? What if my role says that I'm allowed to look at this table, but my individual user permissions say that I'm not? Which one wins? Which one are we going to honor? Put yourself in the position of a security engineer and think. If you were in that situation, yeah. The user permission. So the user permission is going to win out over the role permission, meaning that if there's two permissions in conflict, I'm just going to do whatever is set on the individual user. Is that the idea? Yeah. Be able to read regardless. So if they're given the permission either via the user or via the role, they're allowed to use it no matter what. So those are two different options. Anybody have a different?
I was going to go with the opposite.
The opposite.
Like if anybody says no, either the role or the user.
Yeah, and so if we're thinking about a security from a security perspective, that is the safest way to go about it. If anybody at any point has said you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do it. Period. Denying somebody the ability to access information is always going to take precedence over giving them access to information. So if I explicitly say that you are not allowed to see this via your role or via your specific individual user, then that's it, you're done. That's the safest way to go about it. Otherwise, we risk giving people permission to tables or data that they shouldn't have, perhaps. Now, if I find myself in that situation and I really want to give somebody access, right? There's a solution to that. I can remove them from that role. I can make a new role that's better suited for their particular situation. There are solutions here, right? There are solutions that exist. But yes, in a security perspective, we're always going to favor the most restrictive access in any situation. All right. So let's talk about how attacks occur. Later on, we'll take a look at some specific case studies, some specific attacks that have occurred. But let's talk in a general sense about what kinds of attacks you might expect to see on a database. And actually, these aren't necessarily limited to just databases. Some of them have other utility as well. Unauthorized privilege escalation is, me logging on to Facebook and then convincing Facebook that I have super admin powers to go look at anybody's profile that I want, right? I'm just a normal user. I don't have admin powers on Facebook. But if I can convince Facebook that I do have admin powers, right, then I have gained unauthorized privilege escalation. I'm going somewhere I'm not supposed to be. It's like, going to a concert and waltzing backstage, acting like you belong there. Right? Same idea. Privilege abuse is actually, you told me that I could change this data, right? You told me that I could do stuff with this data, but I do so irresponsibly. So there are many examples of this over the period of time. People getting paid to change data for other people, right? Or perhaps an even more classic example is, I'm working somewhere and you decide to fire me and I get really upset. So what do? On my way out the door, I just delete everything, right? Destroy it all, burn it down to the ground on my way out the door. That's why people typically will deactivate your accounts before they fire you, not after. Those are examples of, I had the privileges, you gave them to me willingly, I just decided to abuse that power. I used it in a way that you did not expect. Denial of service is really, when you see denial of service, that's really an attack on a system's availability. That's really what a denial of service attack is. We're attacking systems availability. Weak authentication is just people with bad passwords, which is like all of us, right? Or at least a good portion of us. This is something that I've become increasingly paranoid about in recent years, and I would urge you all to also become increasingly paranoid about this. Strong passwords are a good thing. Like most computer science things, there are XKCD comics that relate to this. and lots of arguments about how valid the XKCD comics are about this topic. But I think most people do agree that using ABC123 as your password is a bad idea, or using the word password as your password is a bad idea, or using QWERTY as your password is a bad idea. So, you know, choosing strong passwords is a good thing. And then SQL injection is a topic that we have already talked about. We actually talked about that around the midterm. But the idea of, well, you tell me. We've already talked about this. What is SQL injection telling us? What does a SQL injection attack entail? We had a conversation about this a few months back. It takes many forms, but in its most general form, what does it look like? Yeah. Didn't sanitize their inputs. Taking code and typing it into the text box and then getting that code executed on the server. And there are many ways that you can protect against this, which we talked about previously. All right. There are some specialized databases that have some special consideration, especially for those of you interested in the world of data analysis or data science. You'll often run into what's called a statistical database. So a statistical database is a database that contains a bunch of information, perhaps about individuals. So you can see here the schema for a person, right? And you can see that the information here about this person is potentially sensitive. I see social security number, their income, their address, right? All information that, you know, the average person would not want to be publicly available necessarily. However, as data scientists, as data analysts, we care about analyzing this information in various ways. So I might want to figure out, you know, what's the average income by zip code, right? As one possible example of how a database like this might be used, right? Or, you know, average income by sex, you know, as another example of how people might want to use these data to perform data analysis kinds of operations. And so, you know, I want to provide access to this data for the purposes of analysis, but I don't want people to be able to just go dig through the individuals and say, oh, hey, there's my neighbor Bob. Wow, I can't believe that he made so much money. I'm going to go rob his house next week, right? Like, that's not the kind of stuff that we want people to use these types of databases for. So what can we do? How can we perform this kind of analysis? What kinds of security would you expect to be necessary so that we can perform this kind of analysis while still preventing access to individual data? What is the operations that we want to allow? I gave a couple examples of questions, you know, that we might want to answer. What kinds of operations were those that I was just talking about? Yeah, aggregates. And so maybe what we need to do is allow people to examine this data if they're executing aggregates. You can query this data, but only if you're querying it as an aggregate. You cannot look at an individual record. In fact, they'll usually go to a farther extent than that. If you're requesting an aggregate and the number of things that you are aggregating is less than some threshold, right? I'm not going to allow you to do it. That threshold can vary, you know, 5 records, 10 records. The idea there being that if there's only a few records that you're aggregating, you could still maybe reverse engineer the individuals out of that particular pool, right? So there's a minimum threshold. You can perform aggregates as long as those aggregates contain at least a certain number of individuals that will protect them from being outed individually. All right. Another idea that's become popular in the security world with databases recently is this idea of flow control. So sometimes it's difficult enough to protect the data that we have, right? I've got this big pool of data. I'm going to keep it in a secure location, and I'm going to do everything that I can to, you know, put up this walled fortress, right, to keep the outside world out. but it gets more complicated when you actually have to take that data and then move it somewhere else, which there are many reasons why that might be a necessary thing to do, right? Transfer data from one place to the next. So flow control has become an increasingly developing topic here. How can we secure the flow of data from one place to the next? And the big question that we're asking here is, is the destination, is the place where that data is going less secure than where it is now? So the idea is that we're going to start marking things as either confidential or non-confidential, and we're only going to allow data to flow in a certain direction. Data on a non-confidential server can flow into a confidential server, but the opposite direction is not allowed. I'm not allowed to send data from a non-confidential server, from a confidential server to a non-confidential server. It seems very simple, right? It seems very simplistic. Seems almost obvious to do things that way, correct? But there are some problems. One problem here, what if I need multiple levels? This is maybe the easier problem to consider. If I need multiple levels, well, I can just break down, maybe it's not confidential and non-confidential, it's, non-confidential, secret, and top secret, right? And then I can only flow to destinations that are at the same level as me or higher. So that's not a particularly complicated way of envisioning the problem. But there are some other more complicated things to consider, such as sometimes we need a violation. Sometimes I need data to flow from a confidential server to a non-confidential server. In fact, there are examples of stuff that we've talked about in this class over the past few weeks that could constitute a need for this. Can you think of an example of some of the things we've talked about, especially recently, that might require information to be transferred in this manner? Think very general terms. What kinds of operations have we talked about in recent weeks that have involved a lot of communication between servers? What kinds of things? So we've talked about distributed systems, right? What specifically about distributed systems involves communication? What processes? I'm sorry? Partition. So it could be that I've got a table that's partitioned and half of it's on the confidential side and the other half's on the non-confidential side, right? So we're moving in the right direction. Now imagine, what if there's a query that needs access to both parts? There's going to be a transaction, and that transaction manager is going to have to manage the transaction both on the confidential side and the non-confidential side. But in order to complete that transaction, the confidential side is going to have to send information that indicates that it is ready to perform that commit. That is a violation of flow control. I am sending information from the confidential to the non-confidential server. In this case, am I sending data? No. I'm sending a message saying that I'm ready to commit. But that's still a violation of control flow. That's still a violation, of flow control. That's still considered a violation. So in situations like this, there's a quote-unquote loophole, right? We'll set up the way to get around this is they'll set up a covert channel, as it's called. It's a temporary communication channel from the confidential to the non-confidential server that is used to send certain types of information that are needed to perform typical database functionalities. And once those functions are complete, that covert channel is gone. It disappears. As our databases get more and more and more distributed, this is going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger issue. And this is going to become something that a lot of time and effort is spent on understanding in the next few years. Security was a lot easier without distributed systems. Consider it, if I just had one server with all my data, that was pretty straightforward, right? Put all your eggs in one basket and then guard that basket with your life. Set up walls around it. Lock it down. Once distributed systems got in the way, or started becoming necessary, right? They didn't get in the way. They became necessary for performance and other issues. Stuff like this became necessary to deal with the security implications of sending data from point A to point B. What kind of attack would you use to try and intercept data like this? Anybody familiar with security or networking concepts enough to know what that would look like? It's actually fairly straightforward. Man in the middle, yeah. Man in the middle, which for those of you who aren't aware is when somebody's sending information from point A to point B, and I, as point C, stand in the middle, right? I act as a middleman. I take the information from point A, I look at it, I say, oh, hey, that's really nice. I'm going to use that information later, and then I pass it on to point B, so that it looks like the data went through okay, but I'm actually sitting there snooping it all the time. It's a very common attack. In fact, when I was in school many years ago, there was a guy who would sit in the back of the classroom, open up Wireshark, and start sniffing packets of all the stuff that the other students in the class were doing in class, besides listening to the teacher, because everybody is not looking at Facebook or shopping Amazon and stuff during class, right? He would actually look at all that data, sit there. I don't think he did anything with. I don't know. I don't know what he did with it. People weren't very happy about it when they found out, but there was nothing stopping it. There was nothing stopping it. All right, don't do that. I mean, I can't stop you either, but don't do it. Actually, there is something that has become more commonplace that would have stopped him from doing that, made it a lot more difficult at least, which is encryption. So you're about to hear a pitch for using the Wustel encrypted network if you don't already do so, right? Encryption is the act of obscuring the data that's being sent from point A to point B. So I'm going to take data that's being sent from my laptop to the router, which is right there, right there. Oh, there's 4 of them. Wow, this room is loaded. 4 routers sitting on the ceiling, right? I don't know which one I'm talking to right now, probably one of these two. There's data being sent from my computer over there. And if that is not encrypted, somebody could fire up a packet sniffing tool, Wireshark or some other kind of tool, and see what information is being sent from here to here. See that happen. This guy's doing it right now. No, I'm just joking. Maybe he is, I don't know. I hope not. So encryption makes it so that, even if somebody does that, because I can't stop somebody from doing that. That is not possible. I cannot stop somebody from getting between me and the router and looking at that information. That's not possible. But I can obscure my information so that if they are looking at it, they can't tell what it is. That is something that I can do. That is what encryption tries to do for us. Tries to take our plain text data and turn it into ciphertext by using encryption. And this is a very hot topic in the field of security. I have, like 5 or 10 minutes to talk about it, which is not going to do it justice at all. I'm going to scratch the surface of it very lightly, and then if you want to research it more, you are certainly more than welcome to do so. But 2 primary forms of encryption are symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. Symmetric key encryption wasn't used for a very long time, but it involved the use of a secret key that both parties have. So we are sharing a key. It's sometimes called shared key encryption. So I have a key that I use to encrypt my information, and you also have the same key, and you're going to use that to decrypt that same information, right? What's the problem with this approach? What's the problem with having a shared key? Yeah.
Share it over some other thing.
You have to share it, right? How do I get that key from me to you? How do I get that key from me to you? If you're my dad, and I wish this was a joke, but it's not. If you're my dad, you would write it down on a Post-it and send it to me in the mail, right? Like that's one way you could do it. But somebody could see that envelope and be like, aha, now I've got Mr. Shook's public key, and now I can see all of his encrypted data. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you know, the idea is that sending that key is problematic, because if anybody gets your key, they can also see your messages. So Symmetric Key still has its uses, but has greatly fallen out of favor for asymmetric key, public key encryption, where we have two keys now: a public key that I share with everybody, and a private key that is kept only to myself. We send the public key out freely to anybody who wants it. Anybody who wants to send me an encrypted message can use that public key to encrypt the message and send it to me, and then I'll be able to decrypt it with my private key. The mechanisms as to how that works involves a lot of math. I actually love talking about the math behind it. I think it's fascinating, but I'm not going to talk about it today. I think it's a little bit outside the scope of this class, just barely. But I think it is very interesting. I think it's a fascinating topic to talk about. If you want to come have a chat with me in office hours sometime, I'd love to do that. But in general, here's what it looks like, right? I'm going to create two keys. I'm going to mark one as public. Actually, the other person's going to create two keys as well, one public, one private. We're going to share the public ones. We can encrypt messages all we want with somebody else's public key and decrypt them with our private key. Meaning that, you know, if somebody has access to our public key, they can encrypt messages all day long, but they cannot decrypt them. They cannot take that ciphertext and convert it back into plain text. The larger your key is, the more secure it is, and they're built around prime numbers, which is part of the reason why searching for new, very large prime numbers is an interesting little niche in security, computer science. There are actually monetary prizes for finding very large prime numbers these days, which is kind of interesting. And the reason why is because of encryption. If your encryption key is weak, or your encryption scheme is weak for that matter, it's possible to just brute force it. Keep trying different encryptions until you find the one that matches. So the larger your key is, the better protected you are against these types of brute force attacks. All right. So, how am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing great. All right, cool. So then, what we're going to talk about now is, now that we have an idea of you know what security entails, how we should talk about our data, how we should talk about protecting our data. We're going to talk about some challenges that security introduces into the system. We're going to talk about some best practices. What do we do with this information, right? Now that we understand what kinds of tools we have available, what security needs exist, what are some things that we can take out of this room and use the next time we are faced with maintaining the security of an application of our database. And then we're going to take a look at some actual examples of stuff that's happened. So some challenges. Data quality. Security is built on information. In order for me to have good security, I need to have good information. I need to have logs. I need those logs to track the appropriate amount of data that's going to help me not just detect when breaches occur, but also just to make sure that everything's looking okay, right? So do I have enough information to say whether or not a data breach has happened, a security leak has happened? If I don't, somebody could be hacked into my database and sitting there, and I wouldn't even know it. And that would be a big problem, a very, very big problem. Intellectual property rights have become a big thing lately. This really started taking off around the time of like when Netflix started getting big, which was surprisingly a long time ago these days, I suppose. But the idea that, you know, they're sending movies to you over the internet. What's to stop you from just downloading a copy of that movie they sent and keeping it on your computer, right? Or, you know, is there a way to mark a piece of data that's in my database somehow so that if it shows up somewhere else, people know that it's mine, or they know where it came from, right? this already has a name. We have this technique already used for images and video. It's called a watermark, right? I take some visible stamp and I put it on the image, and it doesn't necessarily obscure. I can still see the picture, right? But I can see that, oh, you know, you didn't really do this. You ripped a stock photo off a Shutterstock, because I can see the watermark right there, right? That's what watermarks are used for with images. So can we apply the same technique to data, to any kind of data, not just pictures, but any kind of data? Can I watermark my database so that if data were to get out, I know where it came from? Perhaps. Maybe that'll help me find out who was responsible for getting it out into the world. All right, and then survivability. So what do we do in the worst case scenario when there is a breach? I think most security experts would agree that protecting against all possible avenues of attack is not practical. We need to do the best that we can, but there's always going to be ways to get in, right? So we need to be prepared to deal with that if and when it happens. So first step is to try and confine the attack to as small an area as possible. Immediately start locking down everything else, trying to limit the amount of damage that's been done to prevent additional data from being accessed. Then we really need to figure out how much data, how much damage we're talking about here, how much were they able to hit. Log files are going to be a big help here to see what accounts were used to access the data and what data they accessed. We're going to try to reconfigure the database and allow people to access their data as much as possible while we evaluate, so that the functionality of our application can continue, even though we are trying to assess and fix the situation. Then we're going to repair it as best we can. If the data was changed, we're going to undo those changes. If the data was exposed, well, you can't really unexpose data. That's not something that's doable, but you can at least, contact your lawyers. You don't have many options in that point. And then fault treatment is identifying how it happened and patching the hole so that people don't use that same entryway in the future again. Not a fun situation to be in by any means, but it does happen. And we're going to take a look at some examples of that in just a little bit. So if you ever find yourself being responsible for security of a database, here's what you can do. Here are some best practices to consider. Physical security is really the basics, right? The data physically lives somewhere. You have servers that are plugged into the wall somewhere. So physical security is locking the door, right? Making sure that you can't just have random people walking into the server room and doing whatever they want to the machines. Maybe you don't even want people to know where those server machines are and what's on them, right? That's another aspect of physical security. Do I know where WashU keeps all of my data with my personal information on it? No, actually I don't. Could I figure it out? Maybe. Not sure why I'd want to, but even if I could, they're not just going to let me walk in there. They don't even give me admin rights to, this computer. But that's a different story. I'm not bitter. Firewalls. So your database is probably going to be connected to the internet, probably going to be connected to a network of some sort, right? Because the people who need to use your data aren't going to be sitting in the server room while they access it. Although, actually, in the most secure environments, maybe yes, they are, right? Like, if you really want security, yeah, maybe they will be sitting in that room. But for less secure things, think about your Amazon account, right? I'm not sitting in Amazon's server room giving them my credit card information. I'm sending it over the internet. So we need to make sure that we have firewalls to prevent unauthorized access to that data from the outside world. Harden your database means disable any stuff that you don't need. Databases come with lots and lots and lots of features. Do you need all of them? Probably not. So make sure you turn off the ones that you don't need, because if you leave them on, that could be an avenue that somebody could use to get into your system. So make sure that your database is always up to date and you're downloading the security patches. I know it sounds obvious, right? But I also know that we all hate when we have to update our computers, which is like kind of a counterintuitive thing. You can't get mad when your computer shuts down for an update and also get mad when somebody hacks into your stuff, right? It's two opposite sides of the coin. Those updates exist for a reason. Encryption, we talked about encryption, but that's actually worthy of a whole discussion on its own, right? Encryption algorithms come and go over time. So an algorithm that was strong 10, 15 years ago is probably not so hot anymore, right? Some of them do stand the test of time, or at least they have so far. But that's a constantly changing environment. So staying on top of encryption algorithms that should be used, this is actually one of the classic things to look for is, people using old encryption schemes. Because if it's been cracked, then it's very easy for somebody to start decrypting that data and doing stuff with it. Minimize value. So the idea here is that don't store any information that you don't need to. Could I collect somebody's social security number and credit card number and all this other stuff? Yeah, sure. Do I really need that information to do my job? Do I really need that information to do what my application wants to do? Some cases the answer might be yes. But if the answer is no, then don't do it, right? Just don't keep that valuable information around. It's going to make your database a bigger target. Manage access, that's what we've been talking about a lot. Make sure that you know who's accessing your database and what they have access to. Make sure that you're tracking all of that information, and then perform regular audits. Look at the logs. Reading logs is not one of the most exciting things in the world, but if you're a security expert, it's something that you get used to doing all the time because you are really keeping an eye on what people are doing, what data they're accessing, and when, and for what purpose, so that as soon as something unexpected happens, you are aware of it and you can handle that deviation from normal protocol. Have any of you ever been in a position where you were at least somewhat responsible for managing security of a database? Even a little bit? Yeah, one person, a couple people. I wouldn't. There's a big difference from being like a security admin. Those people are professionals. They make lots of money doing what they do. Versus, even developers oftentimes will have the ability to access data that is at a higher level than just a regular user. Maybe even have a few grant permissions for other developers and things like that that they need to perform their development tasks. If security is not your intended destination, it's still entirely possible that you'll have some security privileges and be in some situations where understanding security is necessary over your career, even if that's not your primary focus. So what I want to spend some time talking about next is a few case studies, a few examples. You might have actually already heard of some of these examples. They are all somewhat famous of when things go wrong, when breaches occur, when security has failed in one way or another. Because we can learn from these, right? We can learn from these kinds of situations. So one that happened somewhat recently, Marriott Hotels had a breach where 500 million users' data was affected. What did they get? They got names, addresses, credit card information, and passport numbers, right? Interestingly, to kind of go into more detail, the credit card information was encrypted. There is a little bit of fuzziness there as to how well it was encrypted, right? The passport numbers in a lot of cases were not encrypted at all. So if you have somebody's passport number, you could theoretically, forge a passport and pretend to be that person, get on planes, do whatever people do with passports, right? Really scary stuff. Really has the potential for some kind of identity theft. So that was a big whoops. How did this happen? So there's a couple of, this actually is a very fascinating story. A couple of many factors as to why this happened. You see, the mode of attack that's listed here is called a remote access Trojan. So I feel like most people have probably heard of Trojans, stemming from the idea of a Trojan horse, where you have a program that's installed onto a computer, and what does that program do? You know, from my perspective, it looks like it's just a regular old program doing program stuff. But in actuality, what is it doing? It's opening, access to your computer so that whoever owns that Trojan, is running that Trojan, can gain unauthorized access to your machine. So how do these Trojans get on to computers? Does anybody know? How do Trojans get onto computers? Yeah. You get emails. So one of the most common ways is phishing attacks via emails, right? It's happened to all of us. I'm certain that we've all seen these crazy emails where it's like, oh, hey, here's that copy of my resume that you wanted, and you click on it, and what does it do? It downloads a Trojan on your computer, and now you're done, right? Game over. That's why they say don't open emails from people you don't know. Don't click on attachments if you don't know what they are, right? Don't do it. So, at the end of the day, right? How did this happen? Somebody successfully fished a database administrator or a system administrator of Marriott's system. Gained access to their computer via Trojan, which gave them the keys to the car. They could log in and do whatever they want. This was made worse by a couple of reasons, though, and I say it's a little more complicated because the database that was compromised was actually a database of a smaller hotel chain that Marriott bought. So it says Marriott here, but the hack was on a smaller chain that Marriott bought in 2016. The hack happened 2 years before Marriott bought this company. They bought the company not knowing that the database was compromised, and the compromise occurred for 2 more years before Marriott caught onto it. 2 more years. So I'm sure Marriott was very happy with their purchase of that company. Why did this happen? Well, part of the blame's on Marriott, because one of the first things they did when they bought the company is they laid off all the IT staff who knew how the system worked, right? So typical corporate stuff that made a bad situation worse, although some of the blame is on that IT staff for letting it go for 2 years before that point too, right? Including the person who originally got phished. The point here being that ultimately, what's the reason for this? Is it because of any technology? Is it because of any gaping security loophole in the system itself? Not necessarily. They fooled a person. They fooled a human being, perhaps multiple human beings. How hard is that to do? Maybe not as hard as you think, right? Maybe not as hard as you think. All right, let's take a look at another one. Yahoo, a very popular, well-known website. 2013, they had 3 billion users' data affected. 3 billion. This is the largest data breach that has ever been recorded in history. 3 billion users' data affected. So what was stolen, or what was exposed? The names, email addresses, security questions. So like when you forget your password and they make you answer, what was the name of your first pet or whatever, right? It was stealing those security questions, and also hashed passwords, right? So what was the mode of attack here? They were using cookies. Any of you familiar enough with network activity to know what a cookie is? Can somebody describe that to me in a sentence or two? It's a cookie. Yeah.
Piece of data stored by the client, usually sometimes in order to authenticate.
Right. So a website is going to store a cookie on my machine. We use them all the time. There are cookies on your machine right now. I promise you there are. Well, maybe not if you've like really locked stuff down. But for most people, you know, cookies are a common thing used all the time on your machine to do things like remember who you are so you don't have to log in every single time, right? Or in the case of, actually where you see them used a lot, it's not for security purposes at all, but for ad tracking systems. If you've ever been shopping on Amazon late at night for, you know, 6-pound gummy worms, and then you start seeing ads for 6-pound gummy worms show up on Facebook the next day. How did they do that? Amazon put a cookie on your computer, and when you went to Facebook, it read that cookie, and it's like, oh, Doug's been searching for gummy worms again. I'm going to show him ads of gummy worms, and maybe he'll actually buy one this time, right? Like that's how that works. That's how ad tracking works. It's because of cookies. But in this case, getting back to the study at hand, they forged a cookie. They made up a cookie that didn't exist. So cookies typically originate from the server, from the website that you're visiting, right? So in this case, this person or multiple persons perhaps forged a cookie. They made one up that tricked the server into thinking that it was someone who they were not, and this someone so happened to have elevated privileges to access data, right? This is not an easy thing to do. Forging cookies is difficult. Cookies are encrypted, typically, for this purpose. I can't just open up a cookie and examine the contents of it. It'll look like gibberish to me. It's encrypted, typically. So for somebody to do this indicates that either there was a lapse in how those cookies were encrypted, that was exploited perhaps, or maybe they weren't encrypted at all. I don't know exactly the details here. In a lot of cases, companies don't like publishing the exact details because it can encourage copycats to try and do the same thing. I should mention though that, you know, the who is important here as well. Both in the Yahoo case and in the Marriott case, the persons involved were alleged to have been state-sponsored, meaning not just some guy sitting in his basement hacking Yahoo for the lulz, but actually like sponsored by a government with resources to throw at this particular problem. Neither company is willing to point fingers at a particular country in particular, but I'm sure most of us could probably take a couple guesses as to likely suspects in that regard. Which raises another question, which is why, right? Why would these countries want to do this? Maybe it is just the country's way of having some lulz, right? Like, I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. The data from this hack, though, did show up for sale in corners of the internet. You could go out and buy Yahoo users' data. There was a big class action settlement where users whose data was stolen were entitled to like $358 or some weird number like that, right? Maybe some of you in this room were affected by it. It seems likely that was the case because there were 3 billion people. Anybody want to fess up to being affected by this one? No? You were on Yahoo then? Yeah? Did you get your $358? Oh, missed opportunity. Yeah, you definitely should. You definitely should. Absolutely. So, you know, there was other interesting ramifications here. This attack happened in 2013, 2014, was not discovered until 2016. Took a while for them to realize that this was happening. And in 2016, Yahoo was trying to get bought by Verizon. They were trying to get Verizon to buy them. And then this news dropped. And then the price that they ultimately sold to Verizon for was a lot less because they had this big mess to clean up. So this kind of stuff has real world ramifications. This kind of stuff matters. Let's take a look at one more. This one's perhaps my favorite of the ones I'm going to talk to you about. A website called Adult Friend Finder. Friend not in the strictly platonic sense, perhaps, was hacked. 500 million users' data was affected. So in this case, directly related to the database, it was a schema breach, right? In terms of what the data was, in this case, the data was not necessarily what you would typically consider confidential data. So things like credit cards, passwords. I think passwords may have been involved. I don't think credit cards were involved in this particular breach, but consider in this case, right, the act of even being associated with this breach is in itself perhaps a breach of confidentiality. How many of you want to fess up to being involved with this breach? Right? Probably not. Probably not. So how did this one work? How did this one work? It used a attack called local file inclusion. Local file inclusion. So the way that a local file inclusion attack works is that you send a request to a website, and that website is using some kind of script on the server side, right? It's running JavaScript or PHP or whatever kind of server-side scripts that it needs to do the thing, and you send a request to the server that has it include a file that is currently on the server in the results, which might seem a little bit confusing. How does that help you, right? You're exposing a file that's already on the server. What's the big deal? The file's already there. There's probably already people looking at that file anyway. Well, a lot of websites have the ability for users to upload files, right? So what if I upload a file that has a script that I wrote that's going to do something like run a database query? Now if I trick you into pointing at that file and showing the results of that file, I can now run code on your server. Whatever code I want on your server. So what kinds of code did this person run? Of course, interestingly enough, this person has a Twitter account where they were publishing this stuff in real time. There's a little bit of coarse language on the next slide. I apologize, but it's 2019, so we're all adults here. What are they publishing? They're publishing all the databases that exist, and then the blacked out information is the user and the password, the name of the database, the username, and the password of the admin account, where the password is the same. All of these blacked out passwords are the same across every single one of these databases. And according to the tweet, there's a fuckload of them. So, right? So this was, live tweeted. This person threatened to expose this website unless they did anything about it. I think Adult Friend Finder's official response was, and it was a big deal, right? It was a big deal. Real ramifications for this. Whoops, wrong button, sorry. So these things happen, right? These are just 3 examples. There are plenty more out there. Not all as large scale as this. So the examples that I've pointed out are particularly large in scale, right? Millions, billions of users. These kinds of things happen all the time on a much smaller scale. And so there are other more practical things that we as database and application programmers can pay attention to help protect our users, since that's ultimately what matters. We're trying to protect our users and our users' data. So you see here, passwords, credit card information has been exposed. In a lot of cases, we're talking about hashed passwords, which is pretty standard these days, but that alone is not enough. Why is hashing a password not enough? How can I get around that? Would you walk up to somebody and give them your hash password? Is that something you would feel comfortable doing? I wouldn't. Why not? How would you get around that? Yeah.
If you know how the password is hashed, you have the hash,
you can brute force it. You can brute force it. Or if you have a password and you know what the hash is, then any other time you see that hash pop up, you automatically know what it started as because you already have the existing information, right? So not just like not all encryption algorithms are created equally, not all hashing algorithms are created equally as well. So this can lead to problems, which means that hashing is not strong enough anymore. There's another technique that we use in addition to hashing. Is anybody familiar? Yeah, salting. Yeah, what's a salt? It's an additional piece of junk, right? It's an additional. It's quite literally just garbage, random gibberish. So when I type my password in to a website, what happens? It doesn't hash my password directly. It takes the salt, it attaches it to the end of my password, and hashes that entire thing as a unit. And that's what gets stored in the database along with the salt. The idea there being that even if they can see the salt, they don't know what my original password is, so it's much harder for them to reconstruct the hash without the full information. So that is the standard. Hashing with the salt is the standard way of storing passwords, also the standard way of storing other types of sensitive information to protect it in the case that it is exposed. But these kinds of things still happen all the time. Yeah?
So it's something I'm going to look about. If they're able to get the salt and they have the hash function, I mean, can't you still just do the exact same brute force?
You can, yeah, you can. So exposing the salt is not typically a great thing to do. People are more and more advocating for keeping those salts stored separately, but the problem there is that, I'm going to use that data all the time. I'm going to need to access that data relatively quickly, right? And really, what are we talking about here? There's varying levels of bad actors that we can protect against. So you can think of security hacking taking on its lowest form, right? The lowest form of security hacking is like somebody left their Facebook account logged in at the Apple store in the mall, right? And you get on their Facebook account and you say, so-and-so's been hacked, right? That's like the lowest form versus a country devoting supercomputers to trying to figure out what your password is, right? Which of those two things is more likely to happen to you? Probably not a country. Country doesn't care about me. I'm nobody particularly special. If I'm in the government, maybe they care about me, right? And then maybe I need to take further measures to make sure that I'm doing things securely. But for average people, that's not a concern. You've got the rogue groups that are your typical, neckbeard in a basement kind of guys, right? That you think of, which are probably also maybe more realistic concerns for us. But their capabilities are not on the level of a country, perhaps. So making things more difficult is going to slow them down at the very least, if not make it impossible for the resources that they have available. And that's all that we can really do. I think it's worth noting that brute force will always work if you have enough time. The reason why brute force is not used more often is because sometimes it can take literally millennia to brute force these passwords. It take longer than lifetimes. But as computers get faster, that number's going to come down, right? And so that's something that we're going to have to pay attention to. In fact, what's the world of quantum computing going to do to this kind of stuff? That's a fascinating question that people are still not sure of. A lot of research is going to be going into that kind of stuff in the future. So, in the meantime, we are obligated to do the best that we can with the resources that we have. Am I going to be able to stop China from getting into my database? No, but I don't think they're going to want to. If China really wants to mess up the leaderboard for my Zelda 2 speedruns that I maintain, then by all means, they can do it. There's nothing I can do to stop them. I've got a backup. It'll be fine. Right? They're not after that. That's not what they're after. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's all I have for you. Are there any questions about what we talked about today? We covered quite a bit of ground. Quite a lot of stuff. Any questions? Local file inclusion. Yeah, so local file inclusion. The local in this case refers to the server. So the server is going to provide access to a file, right, that it normally wouldn't necessarily want to provide access to. Where in this case, the file that it's providing access to is a file that perhaps I, as a hacker, have uploaded to the server that contains malicious code, a script, or something that I don't have the ability to do as a user, but by tricking the server to include this file, right, I have bypassed the typical security protocols and tricked it into running this script, even though normally it wouldn't consider doing so. There's also remote file inclusion, right, which is, as you might expect, a server going out and grabbing a file from somewhere else and executing it. This is closer to what you've maybe heard of as like cross-site contamination, or cross-site scripting, rather, as an example of remote file inclusion, perhaps. Local file inclusion has the additional step of a user being able to upload a file with a bad script on it to the server. A lot of applications allow users to upload files. For Adult Friend Finder, you know, what kinds of files are you uploading? Probably like images and things like that. I don't want to think about it. Right? So if I upload a script instead of an image, and I can convince the server to run that script, I now have control of the server. That's local file inclusion. Any other questions? Yeah. No, it's not. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. Fair question, right? We'll talk about that on Wednesday. I'm going to get some past exams posted up this evening on Piazza. Any other questions? All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today then. I will see you all on Wednesday, and we'll talk about the upcoming exam. Have a great week, everybody.